I mentioned the word triad in passing. And Trent Horn assumed, as the original tweet shows, that he thought this meant something to do with Arianism. I said that, in our debate, you were incorrect by misunderstanding the fact that Abraham worshiped the Trinity. Trent thought this was mind-blowing. How? No, natural theology teaches me that they worshiped a unitarian God in the Old Testament. And then he says, I asked if they knew that God was a Trinity. Jewish multiplicity in the Godhead could be akin to Proto-Arianism. No. In fact, the very point of why we would argue that the Old Testament teaches a triad is to prove that they were Trinitarian, Trent. So, as you can see, his initial reply is quite literally a fundamental misunderstanding of the basics that every Orthodox Christian knows by looking at the Rublev icon, that the Old Testament saints worship the triad. And Trent says, you even had to use the word triad to describe it, but you would say that modern people that worship triad, as in Jehovah's Witnesses, are not worshiping the one true God. So notice that very clearly, Trent didn't even understand the very common terminology amongst the Greek fathers, the Byzantine theologians, the very theologians who dogmatized and solidified and explicated the Trinity, Cappadocians, St. Maximus, etc. For Trent, he thinks this is somehow bound up with Arianism, even though Trent attended, according to his own description, for many years, or presumably for many years, the Eastern Rite. The Eastern Rite hails Palamas as a saint, which actually makes no sense, given the fact that he was considered a damnable heretic for many centuries. And to notice that the most famous work that he has is called the Triads. A simple search would tell you that amongst the Orthodox world, triad refers to Trinity. Does Trent simply say, oh, I misunderstood, you're correct? No, he doubles down because it shows that he's not even familiar with basic terminology in the very fathers that dogmatize the Trinity. Doubles down and says, no, this is an Egyptian term. What? The word can be synonymous with Trinity, but it's more common as a grouping of deities. Look at the 1996 Egyptology book from John Griffith. Now, the more common use is not something from an obscure Egyptologist, Trent. The more common use is what you should know from the uniate world and the Orthodox world of triad, meaning Trinity. This is just silly. Now, Trent doubles down again and says that Old Testament Jews did not worship the Trinity. He says it right here. Did the faithful Jews who lived before Christ's incarnation worship God? If they did, then they must have worshipped the same God of the Trinity of the Christians, even though they didn't worship. Trent does not believe that the Old Testament saints worship the triad, even though Jesus in John 5-9 says that they worshiped the Father, his angel, and his Spirit. So Trent doesn't even know that the Old Testament teaches the triad. Now, I pointed this out at the time of the debate and after we had our debate, and Trent and other people tried to save face and tried to do damage control. He says right here, literally a few seconds ago, that they didn't believe in the Trinity. So do you understand that Roman Catholics do not understand the Trinity? And I don't mean in terms of an intellectual comprehension. They fundamentally have ridiculous, stupid theology. And in order to save face and defend his natural theology a la Vatican II's Nostra Aetate, Trent is literally saying that they believed in a Unitarian God. The very thing that I said was the problem in the debate. Trent still thinks that the Old Testament people believed in a Unitarian God and not the triad. So this refutes all of the Roman Catholic liars that sat here saying that that's not what Trent means. Why do you Roman Catholics feel the need to lie? And how could you be this silly in your theology to be so ignorant of the Old Testament? Again, proving my point in the debate that how would you argue against a Muslim? Do you not understand that to debate any Muslim requires going to the Old Testament to prove the Trinity? I even showed a video that was my opening statement in the Daniel Hakikachu debate to Trent, which apparently he hasn't watched because it refutes his stupid heresy. And Acts 17 in no way says that they worshiped a Unitarian God. It's just like this guy is on another planet and doesn't even understand what the debate is. And now the libertarian says he can't hop on. Dude, I sent you the link. There's no reason why you can't hop on this debate. It's an open chat. You wanted to debate. Now you're saying he can't get on here. Give me a break. Here you are. You hopped on here. Now, all right, where's the actual video? I hope you guys understand that this means that Roman Catholics don't have the basics of the Trinity. I'm pretty sure the Trinity is a pretty important doctrine. And you just saw Trent say that in the tweet that he just put up. The very thing that all of his defenders were saying he didn't mean. He says it again. Now let's remind ourselves of a few moments of the debate with Daniel Hakikachu, because it turns out Trent and Daniel have the same God, the Unitarian generic God of natural theism. Now, I know that Trent would confess to believe in the Trinity and the deity of Christ, but he doesn't understand that he's got two conflicting, contradictory positions in his worldview. And he doubled and tripled down in the last hour on Twitter on this. So I repeat again, did the Old Testament saints worship a generic Unitarian deity? The very thing that Trent and Roman Catholicism, Nostra Aetate, and Trent just now, within the last 5 minutes, reaffirmed? Or did they worship the triad, as every Orthodox person knows? You understand that this is fundamental to us. And they're still wandering around, groping in the dark like the pagans of Acts 17. Not understanding that it's a triad in the very beginning. Because their theology is all jacked up and dumb. That's why. Because they're in a giant machine that they have to make all of these pieces work and make this giant algorithm that's a giant bunch of contradictions fit together, and they don't. They don't even know what recapitulation is. They don't even know what monarchical Trinitarianism is when it's fundamental in orthodoxy. So let's go back to how we would argue with a Muslim to refute Trent. We're the Old Testament Jews, generic Unitarians. Let's look at Jewish scholarship explaining to us what they believe.
Which may cause some people some surprise is that the Old Testament prophets were Trinitarian. They were not Unitarian. Judaism, specifically in the Second Temple period, was not a monolithic Unitarian enterprise. The question becomes, what are the teachings of the prophets in the Old Testament? Did they actually teach, as Islam says, a radical Unitarianism? Or is it something more fluid? Or is there differentiation in Yahweh? In fact, modern Jewish scholarship unanimously is undecided on this question. There's a lot of Jewish scholarship that is listed here. For example, Daniel Boyarin. Later, I have Sommer and I have Siegel. And they admit that in the Old Testament itself, not due to Christian deviation, but in the Old Testament itself, we find many, many passages that show differentiation in Yahweh. That differentiation is not just located in rabbinic debates. It also continues into later medieval debates with Jewish Kabbalah. And you can see there, for example, Gershom Scholem in his book on Kabbalah. He's the respected Kabbalist theologian of the Middle Ages, or scholar of medieval Kabbalah. He points out, for example, the three beginningless lights that are mentioned. Now, I'm not a Kabbalist. I'm just pointing out that this shows that the Jewish tradition is not monolithic in its presentation. So I'd like to come back then to my screen, to me here, and point out that the first display of Trinitarian theology in the Law and the Prophets is, for example, here on this whiteboard. And I'm showing this whiteboard because, hopefully you guys can see this. This is a tremendous amount of text.
Now, this list of texts that you see me post, if you've read Justin Martyr against Trypho the Jew, is Trent even aware that Justin Martyr argues from the Old Testament theophanies to prove the deity of Christ and his attempt at proving triad? It's like Trent's never talked to a Muslim or never read these church fathers. Oh, but wait a minute, Trent didn't know what the word triad meant. He thought it was a pagan anti-Trinitarian term when it's constantly used in the Eastern Church Fathers. So now Trent is doubling down, as we said, tripling down, that the Old Testament saints did not worship the Trinity. They worshiped a Unitarian God. Has he never read John 5 through 9? Has he not read 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul says that Moses looked face to face with Jesus? If no man sees the Father at any time, as Jesus argues in John to the Pharisees in John 5, then who was Moses talking to? This is the point of Jesus' argument to the Pharisees. I don't think Trent knows the Bible very well at all, and particularly not the Old Testament at all. I think Trent knows a lot of pop apologetics, because remember, Trent was not too long ago a deist who converted to Roman Catholicism. And so I don't think Trent knows the Trinity. I think he just accepts that the papacy got all this right. And that's why most of his debates are cultural issues or the papacy. I mean, maybe he's debated other topics. I don't know. I don't follow these pop Roman Catholic apologists because they're typically pretty low tier. But I mean, this is just sort of mind-blowing to me. What did we just talk about last night? We spent the first hour talking about Old Testament predictions of the Messiah. And when the Muslim called in, we started to go into various texts in Isaiah. And as I mentioned, there are more than you could even imagine in Isaiah if you haven't read Isaiah in a long time. It's called the fifth gospel for a reason. Trent, why would it be called the fifth gospel if the Old Testament teaches a unitarian God? Why is the Messiah said to be worshipped? Why does it talk about Yahweh, his son, his angel, his covenant messenger, and his spirit? All the way back in Genesis. Do you understand that Genesis teaches the triad? Do you understand that when Trypho is arguing against Justin Martyr keeps arguing from Genesis and other passages to prove that? Who do you think Jacob was wrestling with? These people have never read the Bible or something. But wait a minute. If we're talking about Roman Catholics, that's actually fairly plausible. Outside of someone like Scott Hahn, I'm starting to think that maybe they don't actually read the Bible. It's a closed book to them. As Paul says, it's a closed book to the Jews in 2 Corinthians 3. The very passage where it says Moses was talking face to face with Christ, that the Jews have the veil over their heart, it's almost like Roman Catholics and Muslims have the veil over their heart. Yeah, because they're facsimile fake religions. That's why. They're religions of dead works without the power thereof.
And I'm just citing these because there's too many to fit on a single screen there with typing it all out. You can screenshot this later and go check the various textual references here for just examples of theophanies. And the reason I've included the theophanies is that these are particularly useful for demonstrating the manifestation of Yahweh in the Old Testament, proving differentiation. So not just Yahweh, but also the angel messenger that he sends, who has the name of Yahweh, as we read in Exodus, the same angel that's present in the burning bush. That angel is spoken of as the messenger of the covenant. He's spoken of as, in Judges, turning the face of Yahweh towards Gideon.
Yahweh turns his face to Gideon. So are you noticing a pattern that the refutation of Muslims is becoming the refutation of the Roman Catholics? Because Trent's actually in a backwards way, backdoor way, correct, that actually you and the Muslim and the Jew do worship the same God because it's the wrong God. So Roman Catholics, Muslims, and Jews actually do worship the same Unitarian God, and that's the wrong one. So actually Trent, in a roundabout way, is actually correct. And why does he say that? Because that's the basis of his church's dogmatic teaching in Nostra Aetate, and he doesn't even realize that citing Acts 17 doesn't prove this. Citing Romans 1 doesn't prove this. He's just assuming that Acts 17 and Romans 1 teach natural theology, when Romans 1 doesn't say anything about syllogisms and a ratiocination process about syllogisms and coming to some conclusion at the end of a bunch of syllogisms about a generic God existing. Romans 1 says that it's on the heart of every man. It doesn't say anything about intellectual syllogisms. It's not talking about natural theology in your ridiculous church's sense. But Trent knows he has to defend Nostra Aetate, saying that he and the Hindu and all of them worship the same God. Isn't that interesting? The Hindu also is part of this natural theology process. And he thinks Acts 17 backs this up. All Acts 17 says is that God is the one giving these providential gifts to everyone, and yet he is unknown. The very point of the passage is that the God that they're after is unknown to them. And yet Trent is telling me, no, actually, at the end of a rational process, the pagan can reason out and come to, at the end of a syllogism. How many pagans are sitting there doing syllogisms outside of Aristotle? Let's be real here. Come on, this is preposterous. And even his own people, his own cohorts whom he's had debates with, are falling out like Tim and recognizing, hey, wait a minute, the Roman Catholic Church's post-Vatican II teaching on the Jews is a direct contradiction to the pre-Vatican II teaching on the Jews. But it's also a contradiction when it comes to Muslims and Hindus too. You don't see that? The Catholic Church regards with esteem the Muslims. Oh, you mean the ones that you called crusades against? in the Middle Ages? You esteem them? They adore the one God. What is the one God that's shared between a Muslim and a Roman Catholic when every Muslim will tell you that we don't worship the same God as you? There is no generic unity that is shared amongst an anti-Trinitarian group and a satanic group and a monotheistic group. If I believe that Satan is the creator of heaven and earth and that he lives and subsists in himself, am I then also esteemed by the Catholic Church with the Muslims? Do you see how stupid this is? And then it goes on to say, although they don't revere Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. Oh, so anti-Trinitarians. So now we can substitute Eunomians and Arians and Jehovah's Witnesses. The church regards with esteem the Arians. Does it? Because I'm pretty sure at Nicaea it calls Arius the mouth of Satan. So now we regard Arius as the mouth of Satan, as a true worshiper of the one God. Do you understand? Muslims are more removed than Arians are from Christianity. There are multiple attributes that Muslims don't believe in. They do not believe that God is immanent in the world. And maybe even some Roman Catholics don't believe that. Who knows? I mean, this whole Roman Catholic system is a gigantic mess. And you've noticed they won't come and debate anymore. All they're left with is why I'm a bad person. That's all they've had for the last 7 years, is how I'm a bad person. And yet they keep expanding in their carbohydrate intake. Have you noticed that Ibarra and Lofton are looking even fluffier? Well, I guess when the religion is no help, you take solace in the buffet and in dainties and pastries. But it's not just Muslims. Oh, whereas the Roman Catholic Church formerly talked very negatively in its liturgical practices about Jews, now they're the elder brothers. And they're part of the covenant? That doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction to previous traditional Roman Catholic teaching. Now, where's the Hindu statement? Now, remember, this is not saying that Hindus seek out and have a natural desire for the one true God, because we could say that all human beings have an innate desire for God, because we all have a nous. This says that in Hinduism, in other words, in the false religious system, the demonic system of Hinduism, and if you read Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, you can see very clearly that from the Christian perspective, this is a horrendous, terrible demonic religion. Does Vatican II say that? It doesn't mention anything about it being demonic. It says, in Hinduism, men contemplate the divine mystery and express it through an inexhaustible abundance of myths. They seek freedom from the anguish of human condition through ascetical practices or a profound meditation or flight to God with love and trust. God with a capital G. Did you read the first sentence? In Hinduism, in a completely demonic religion, Paul says that the nations are devils. David says the gods of the nations are devils. There's no better example of this than Hinduism. Vatican II says in Hinduism, they seek a flight to capital G God with love and trust. And then it says similar things about Buddhism. The deities of Hinduism and Buddhism are not the triad. They are not secretly Jesus. If Jesus has a way to reach those people, he can do that. But it is not the demonic system of Hinduism or of Buddhism that is the means by which they reach God. And that's the bizarro language of Vatican II. And it's not just Nostra Aetate. The same stuff is said in Lumen Gentium 16, because these liars will always sit here and say, well, we don't have to accept Nostra Aetate because it doesn't have the same level of authority as the other documents. You got to accept them all. And what a ridiculous system anyway, because it doesn't even tell you which documents are which. Every individual Roman Catholic has to figure out which documents are in which authority bin. The plan of salvation includes those who acknowledge the Creator. Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean I only have to acknowledge a generic idea of a Creator, like a Freemason does, or a theistic Satanist? The first amongst these is the Muslims, who hold the faith of Abraham. No, you don't hold the faith of Abraham if you're anti-Trinitarian. Have you read Galatians? The only way to be the seed of Abraham is in Christ, because Abraham worshipped the triad. Did you hear me, Trent? Muslims worship and adore the one God. No, Muslims do not adore God. You understand? Adoration is worship. So this implies that God accepts the worship of anti-Trinitarian groups like Muslims. Muslims hate the triad. They hate Christ because they don't believe that he is divine. And John says, if you don't believe that Christ is God in the flesh, you are a spirit of Antichrist. So this is saying that people who have the spirit of Antichrist motivating them to stamp out Christianity and the Trinity and the deity of Christ are part of the plan of salvation and also actually worship Christ. This is preposterous. This alone is enough to tell you that this is not the true religion. This is a departure from Christianity. And Trent and all the other frauds are defending this. And they will keep doubling down and doubling down and doubling down, because to admit that they're wrong on this means this whole system collapses. And Roman Catholicism is a giant cult. And they cannot accept that it is this blatant, this out in the open, and this fraudulent. And it is, because it's in everyone's face. This is why they act out so. This is why they spurg out. This is why they lose it. This is why they're calling you names and everything in the book. It's all a manifestation of the deep down insecurity and fear that they know about their papacy and what it does and how it acts and how deceptive it is.